Steel to the edge, ports, pipelines, and emergency infrastructure. While those meetings dragged, cranes were already swinging. The press releases said safety first, but the welds told another story. A new pier rolled out over permafrost on helical piles, with bollards rated for ships that weigh as much as a skyline. The ribbon cutting talked about medevac access. The blueprint listed fender panels sized for Arc 7 LNG hulls. The Port Authority unveiled a rescue hangar. The fuel farm beside it had transfer arms spec'd for midwinter offload. If you looked at the hose diameters, you could read the future. Here's where the dual-use logic hardened. Emergency infrastructure was the passphrase. A helicopter pad justified by search and rescue doubled as crew changed staging. A heated warehouse for disaster relief sat at the exact turning basin radius needed for ice-class tankers. The breakwater that shielded small craft was poured to tame prop wash from 45-megawatt azipods. The brochure showed a Coast Guard cutter in the foreground. The procurement spreadsheet showed berthing windows for LNG carriers and heavy-lift modules. Meanwhile, Russia went all in on steel. Sabetta wasn't just a dot on a map, it was an Arctic factory gate. Yamal LNG turned a frozen peninsula into a metronome of outbound cargoes, each hull an Arc 7 that could chew through flows and still make schedule. Arctic LNG 2 followed with gravity-based platforms set like chess pieces on the shelf edge. Rosatomflot's nuclear icebreakers idled outside like tow trucks with reactors, ready to escort convoys east toward Asia or west toward the White Sea. Call it rescue, call it energy security. On AIS, it looked like throughput. China's fingerprints showed up in financing, modules, and a phrase that sounded like a poem and a plan: the Polar Silk Road. Nodes appeared where feasibility met leverage. A laid-on yard here, a dredged approach there, all wrapped in language about connectivity and sustainable development. In briefings, officials pointed to the Northern Sea route as a global good. In contracts, offtake agreements and shipbuilding orders locked in decades of volume. Across the pole, Canada and the US hit the same wall, the icebreaker gap. There were speeches about recapitalization and timelines that slid like pack ice on a warm current. While budgets crawled, private owners filled the void with ice-class AHTS vessels and chartered tonnage that could reroute on a text. A corporate fleet doesn't salute a flag, it salutes a day rate. If a convoy needed a path through rotten ice in late September, the first hull to show with steel in the bow set the rules for everyone behind it. Subsea, another layer, stitched the Arctic together. A cable proposal promised a new transpolar artery, far north fiber, Tokyo to northern Europe, with a latency cut that traders could feel in their P and LS. 50 milliseconds sounded like trivia to most people. In finance, it's rent. Landing stations turned into sovereignty fights. Who gets to tax a millisecond? Who gets lawful access to taps labeled as maintenance? Every permit hearing talked resilience. Every term sheet priced exclusivity. Satellites arced above it all, filling in the blind spots. Ice concentration maps refreshed like stock tickers. Synthetic aperture radar picked out ridges, rubble fields, and dark holes that went quiet on AIS. Drones joined the stack, shoreline surveys for erosion monitoring that conveniently traced out pipeline corridors and future tank farm footprints. The data helped pilots avoid pressure ridges. It also helped logistics planners shave hours, then days, from turnarounds. Meanwhile, pipelines crept toward the coast. Not the continental-scale snakes we argue about on talk shows, short, brutal links from gas-rich fields to loading arms. Buried low to dodge ice scour, sleeved where Thor might wrench steel apart, and block-valved like beads on a rosary. Officially, they were export terminals with environmental safeguards. In reality, they were cash machines that only made sense if ships kept arriving on a schedule built around thinner ice and longer shoulder seasons. Communities saw the gear arrive before they heard the justification. An emergency barge showed up with prefab dorms. The sign said, "Responder housing." The rental agreement handed the keys to a contractor running 3 shifts. A mobile clinic landed on a Hercules, great for a storm, better for pre-departure medicals. A new VHF repeater went live on the ridge. The channel traffic turned into tug masters calling lineups and pilots trading flow edge notes in shorthand. There was one detail that soured the speeches. Spill response under ice hadn't been solved. Not in trials, not in field conditions, not when the wind pushed slabs together like dinner plates in a sink. The skimmers that worked in shoulder seasons failed under grease ice. Burning off oil needed daylight and air gaps that don't exist in polar night. Booms froze, fractured, and rode up on floes. The videos cut before the part where everything jammed. The port placards promised compliance. The winter said otherwise. Then an irony, the more rescue capacity got built, the more ships came north because rescue existed. A bigger hangar meant a longer convoy season. Extra medevac cover turned a red risk amber. The escort queue stretched. And every new piece of steel, every bollard, pile, cable landing and warehouse made the route feel inevitable. Not because nature invited it, but because accounting did. Hardware in place, the board flipped. Convoys didn't need to ask if the Arctic was open. They asked who controlled the gate, what the escort would cost, and whether the wind would hold until Tuesday. The brochures still said safety. The invoices read access. And once access was priced, the question shifted from whether to sail to how many hulls could you push through before the next freeze. The $1 trillion shortcut, opening the Northern Sea route. While pilots traded flow-edge notes, someone else ran the math. Shanghai to Rotterdam through Suez is a habit. Through the Arctic, it's a shortcut. On a planner's screen, the line via the Northern Sea route shrank the world by around 40%. 10 to 15 days vanished from schedules. At bunker prices that move with every headline, that kind of time turns into money before the propellers even start. The stakes were simple and brutal. If a ship can arrive nearly 2 weeks earlier, charterers save on day rates, shippers claim fresher inventory windows, and financiers slice risk off balance sheets. For crews, shorter voyages mean fewer storms at lower latitudes, but more time threading ice where a mistake is final. For ports south of the Arctic, it meant fewer calls, thinner margins, and idle cranes. The shortcut didn't just clip miles, it shaved livelihoods. Here's what actually happened. Rosatomflot turned escorts into a business product. Nuclear icebreakers idled like patient bulldozers, then powered up to lead seasonal convoys along the Laptev and Kara. Permissions rolled out of Moscow like boarding passes: join the convoy, stick to the slot, pay the fee. The de facto toll booth wasn't a gatehouse, it was a schedule. Miss your window and you didn't negotiate, you waited, burning time you couldn't insure. Meanwhile, carriers ran spreadsheets that treated ice like a surcharge they could live with. A 40% distance cut stacked with fuel savings and trimmed time charter exposure. Insurance desks adjusted riders, hull premiums ticked up, but route savings sometimes outpaced the risk. One broker summed it up over coffee: "We're not gambling, we're arbitraging September." The language gave away the shift. Weather was variable, policy was the risk. But there was one problem baked into the route: control. Sanctions and permissions turned into twin screws. Some hulls could buy the escort, others couldn't clear a compliance department. A shadow fleet learned to ride the shoulder season, going dark on AIS in polar night and reappearing at the edge of lawful lanes. Enforcement was a patchwork, and the icebreaker at the head of the line decided what allowed looked like in practice. Choke points moved on the mental map. The Straits of Malacca still mattered, but planners started watching the Vilkitsky, Dmitry Laptev, and Sannikov Straits like traders watch yield curves. Winds pinched ice into pressure ridges that behaved like floating border walls. A westbound train of bulkers could find itself stacked behind a single grounded hull, and everyone knew it. The Arctic didn't replace Suez. It added a new set of dice to the table. Micro-stories made the abstraction bite. A scheduler in Hamburg watched a dot jump on her screen, an Arc 7 LNG carrier clearing the Laptev early thanks to a lucky high. That jump meant she could pre-sell cargo 2 days sooner and undercut a rival who sailed south. In Yokohama, a port agent's phone blinked. Revised ETA 12 days earlier than last year's lane. He called a trucking boss who didn't ask about ice. He asked how many hours he had to pull drivers from a festival weekend. Meanwhile, insurers tried to tax uncertainty into order. Riders paid out for propeller damage from brash ice, but excluded under-ice collision with uncharted rubble fields. Captains compared notes about underkeel clearance that changed with the tide and the melt. Every story had a refrain: follow the icebreaker. That meant whoever owned the breaker could shape the route economics all the way back to a retailer's shelf. The economics rippled. If 10 to 15 days fall out of a voyage, a shipping line can do one extra round trip each season with the same hulls. That additional rotation, multiplied across a fleet, looked like found capacity. Banks priced that like an asset. Investors wrote memos with a new phrase, Arctic uplift, then buried the sensitivity table where winter could still win. But there was a catch. The window was seasonal, unpredictable, and narrowing only in averages, not in any specific week. One late storm could turn an open lead into a crusher of bows. Rosatomflot's convoys smoothed the variance, not the physics. A captain who tried to freelance a shortcut across new ice learned the old lesson fast. The Arctic is generous to no one and lethal without warning. Then came the sanctions twist. Some buyers would pay a premium for Arctic-arriving cargo if it didn't trigger secondary penalties. Others wouldn't touch it at any price. The route split the market into acceptable and actionable. Compliance officers started showing up at voyage planning calls. Lawyers learned ice charts. Meanwhile, coastal communities watched more lights on the horizon and asked fewer theoretical questions. Search and rescue flights trained to chase medevacs across a longer corridor. A small clinic ordered more anti-frostbite kits because conv escorts meant more people, more often, farther from help. The shortcut had a hidden ledger that didn't appear in voyage math. This was the moment everything changed in planning rooms. The Arctic route stopped being a thought experiment and started behaving like a conditional asset. If the escort was available, if the ice stayed loose, if the insurer signed, you sailed. If not, you deferred and watched a competitor claim the spread. And with lanes opening, everyone remembered the quiet line from earlier. The real money sat under the seafloor, waiting for a route to normalize the traffic above it. Beneath the ice, the resource ledger no one publishes. To understand why a shipping lane became a balance sheet, we need to look below the hulls. The public numbers float on the surface. The private ones live in cores, seismic grids, and spreadsheets that never meet daylight. The headline is familiar, 50 trillion, but the ledger that props it up is stitched from estimates, probabilities, and a quiet bet that the Arctic will be treated like a warehouse, not a world. Start with what's on paper. The USGS mapped a trove that still shows up in investor decks. Roughly 90 billion barrels of undiscovered oil and about 1,669 trillion cubic feet of undiscovered gas clustered around the shelves. That's not a promise, it's a range. Proven, probable, possible. Each step down the ladder adds uncertainty and adds zeros to slide decks. The gas dominates near the continental edges, pooled in layers that were once river deltas and shallow seas, while oil tends to sit in faulted basins where heat and time did their work. That geometry decides who drills first and who stalls. Meanwhile, minerals trace older stories. Nickel and cobalt ride Precambrian shields that ring the Arctic like a buried necklace. Rare earth elements pop up in alkaline complexes and carbonatites that sound like geology exams but spin like policy levers. The seafloor nodules whisper a future extraction play that no one wants to admit is on the whiteboard. Metals harvested from a place that breaks gear and careers. Greenland is the tease that refuses to settle. Sedimentary basins along its western shelf light up seismic lines with enough promise to keep core boxes shipping and rumors busy. Inland, Kvanefjeld sits heavy, one of the world's largest rare earth and uranium resources in the same rock. The math there is brutal. Schenk's stake means downstream leverage, uranium byproduct means political blowback, and a 2021 election proved that a local vote can freeze a global supply chain plan. Funding for more cores keeps slipping in through grants, JV term sheets, and research budgets with off-take clauses. Here's what mattered to the people making bets. Gas near shore turns into LNG fast if you can get a pipe to a berth and a berth to a convoy. That stacks neatly with an escort regime that monetizes September and October. Oil farther out demands more steel, deeper water gear, longer exposure to weather windows that don't care about schedules. So portfolios tilt to gas in the near term, oil in the long, and both wrapped in talk of transition that lets the same firms sign two kinds of contracts without flinching. Meanwhile, the mineral column feeds a different kind of urgency. Nickel for batteries, cobalt for stability, rare earths for magnets. Every EV target turns a mountain into a meeting. The Arctic's value here isn't just tonnage, it's optionality. If a state can point to a belt of ore within its extended shelf or its near-coastal control, it can negotiate supply chain resilience with a straight face. Ports become not only LNG gates, but ore export nodes, and rescue hangars double as staging for drill programs that clock in under the environmental radar. The stakes for communities are counted in contradictions. A mine promises wages and an airstrip upgrade. It also promises more diesel on the water and more ships in hunting lanes. An exploration rig brings a clinic generator. It also brings waste drums that never seem to leave when the season ends. Consultation rooms fill with terms like probable reserve and induced seismicity, while the questions people ask are simpler. Who fixes the road when the trucks tear it up? Who pays when the permafrost sinks under the warehouse you said was temporary? Action moved in bursts. An exploration team flew in on a blue sky day, drilled 3 cores, and flew out with coolers of rock and a dozen NDAs. A finance team modeled the USGS numbers 3 ways, low, mid, high, and attached discount rates that quietly assumed a longer navigable season. A minister cut a ribbon on a lab for environmental monitoring that processed assays after hours. A coastal council signed a memorandum for broadband that routed through a building also labeled Geodata Exchange. The impact was immediate in the parts of the world that watch commodities like weather. Nickel prices spiked on rumors of a new target zone. Cobalt shifted on whispers of a road upgrade 2 summers out. LNG offtake calendars stretched into the 203s with clauses that referenced ICE data written like force majeure but read like strategy. The ledger thickened with rents. Shipping saved days, data shaved milliseconds, minerals filled gaps, and hydrocarbons banked on the math that September would outpace January. But there was one problem the spreadsheet never solved: boundaries. The 50 trillion stack isn't just geology, it's jurisdiction. Reserves that look bankable inside a line on a map become lawsuits when that line moves over a ridge. A gas field that seems near shore on a national chart becomes disputed in a UN filing footnote. The ledger assumes ownership the law hasn't granted yet. Numbers are huge, but claims decide who can touch them. To see how that game is played, we have to leave the cores on the table and step into a courtroom drawing lines on moving ice to the UNCLOS chessboard. The courtroom didn't look like a place for oceans. Fluorescent lights, stacks of binders, and a wall-sized map that turned the Arctic into contour lines and numbers. On the table, petitions, cores, and a word that sounds boring until it moves trillions: jurisdiction. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, a coastal state owns its 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. Beyond that, there's a door you can try to open: the extended continental shelf. To claim it, you don't wave a flag. You prove the seafloor is your continental margin in rock and mass. Stakes, they're human even here. A community hears that a ridge under the pole might place gas inside one country's legal reach and outside another's. That changes who issues permits, who collects rents, who hires the tug, and who shows up when it goes wrong. For ministers, this is legacy politics. For companies, it's de-risking. For people on the coast, it decides whose phone rings when a convoy misses the window. Here's what actually happened. Russia filed first, back in 2001, asking the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, CLCS, to recognize a far reach built on ridges with names that sound like expeditions: Lomonosov, Mendeleev, Alpha. The Commission told them to bring more data. Russia came back with more bathymetry, seismic profiles, dredged samples, and in 2007 sent a submersible to the seafloor at the pole to plant a titanium flag. The stunt wasn't law, it was a message. The real weapons were cores and cross-sections. Denmark, acting via Greenland, submitted in 2014. Their argument: the Lomonosov Ridge isn't Russia's extension, it's Greenland's. Canada followed with its own filings, tying the ridge to its continental shelf from Ellesmere. On paper, the claims overlap by hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, including the very top of the world. In hearing rooms, the tone stayed calm. In footnotes, it bristled. Which seismic horizons count? Which crust is continental, not oceanic? Which definitions apply when a ridge is a geological riddle? Meanwhile, deadlines crept like glacial ice. Countries raced to lodge submissions before windows closed, then dripped addenda and revised charts as new data arrived. The CLCS can issue recommendations, but it can't settle disputes. Overlaps have to be negotiated, and nobody negotiates happily when a 50 trillion ledger sits behind the curtain. So states lawyered up, funded science cruises, and sent icebreakers north with labs bolted to their decks. What nobody knew at the time was how much hydrography would feel like infantry. A survey line laid across the central basin became a stake in a legal argument. A corps pulled from a ridge flank turned into a sentence in a submission that edged a boundary 40 nautical miles outward. Each expedition was framed as research. Each research cruise mapped the path for a claim that could outlast the ship that made it. There was one problem the charts couldn't smooth over. The ice was changing as the filings piled up. Melt seasons stretched, pressure ridges shifted, and the very conditions that made routes viable also complicated fieldwork windows. Scientists hustled to capture data that felt like moving targets, then packed their logs into binders that would be parsed years later in rooms with no windows. The law demanded permanence. The Arctic offered anything but. Indigenous leaders watched the dance and saw a different map. Traditional territories didn't sit neatly over easy lines. Hunting grounds crossed national grids like weather. The UNCLOS process put states at the microphone and communities in the gallery. Consultation existed, but representation gapped. A filed map could bend how a community's future was funded without ever speaking its language. An elder's ocean knowledge didn't count as evidence unless it fit a clause. Action revealed the quiet power moves. A Coast Guard cutter patrolled a line that wasn't settled yet, then logged the voyage as presence. A research vessel deployed an ROV over a ridge and took footage for a science paper and for an annex in a legal packet. A minister announced funding for a geoscience initiative that hired both graduate students and consultants who wrote the memos companies later quoted to investors. The boundaries weren't inked, but enforcement behavior rehearsed them. Impact rippled fast. Oil and gas firms adjusted acreage appetites to hug likely boundaries, hedging bets with joint ventures on both sides of contested zones. Greenland's case put pressure on Copenhagen and Ottawa to synchronize strategies that didn't always align with local politics. Russia, deep into its Arctic development arc, framed shelf gains as national destiny and budget logic. In capitals far south, diplomats traded maps behind closed doors, aware that once CLCS recommendations landed, everyone's opening offers would harden. Then a twist surfaced in a commission summary. The Lomonosov Ridge, by some readings, might not qualify as a submarine elevation that simplifies claims. That technical phrase had teeth. If the ridge behaved more like oceanic crust, the extension arguments got narrower, filings got hairier, and the negotiation space got meaner. It didn't end the game. It changed the playbook. Meanwhile, on the water, paperwork didn't slow ships. Escorts still ran, convoys still stacked. Boarding parties from coast guards acted like tax collectors with badges, interpreting jurisdiction on the fly in channels where the difference between legal and contested was a snow squall and a mile. Enforcement by other means stepped in where law lagged. This was the moment everything crystallized. The map on the wall wasn't just lines and labels. It was a knife that would cut the ledger. And because the ice was moving, the hand that held the knife belonged to whoever had the ships, the satellites, and the nerve to act first. Patrols, shadow fleets, and silent subs, enforcement by other means. While the lawyers debated bathymetry, cutters and corvettes drew their own lines. A boarding party stepping from a grey hull to a darker one looked like routine safety. On the manifest, it was taxation. Papers please, logbook open, cargo list checked against permits that referenced coordinates most crews couldn't pronounce. The message was simple: if you sail this lane, you pay the keeper, whether the treaty is finished or not. Stakes were immediate for anyone moving cargo or catching fish. A hold full of cod could turn into a fine if a waypoint strayed over a claimed boundary. An LNG carrier could lose a day and a market window if an escort demanded a compliance check. For communities along the coast, a cutter at the horizon meant medevac on a good day and pressure on a bad one. Presence wears a polite face until it needs teeth. Here's what actually happened. Coast Guards became revenue protection with search and rescue branding. A white and red hull paced a conv, then peeled off to board a bulker that lagged behind. Inspectors checked ice class certificates and fuel logs, then hinted at routing advice that sounded a lot like orders. For safety, the officer said, redirecting a ship toward a channel where escorts were for sale. The invoice arrived later, clean as a boarding ladder. Known to them across the night, another fleet sailed without names. Shadow tankers with fresh paint and old scars drifted into polar twilight as AIS dots winked out. Call it darkness or deniability, either way the traffic didn't stop when the screens went blank. Crews learned to run quiet, low lights, tight convoys, and a tolerance for silence that made insurers sweat. These ships showed up where sanctions and schedules collided, moving cargoes that needed to arrive and couldn't be seen arriving. Micro story: a chief mate on a reflagged product tanker watched their transponder fail in a snow squall. 30 minutes later, a second hull slid into formation, barely visible against the flow edge. They matched speed by instinct and nerve, rode the ridgeline of a radar return, and parted 2 hours later with a whistle nobody on shore would hear. Weeks after, the invoice hit an account routed through 3 shells and 1 brass plate in a city without sea. Meanwhile, submarines wrote the part of the map nobody will publish. Under the pack, silent hulls traced cables and surveyed seabeds for the kind of detail that turns legal theory into tactical certainty. Crews counted seconds between pings and measured the slope of a ridge with sonar like a blind hand on a staircase. They laid small things you won't see on a satellite: acoustic nodes, distributed sensors, and markers that told a captain in a language of echoes where a keel could pass and where it would die. There was one problem surface fleets couldn't solve: awareness without daylight. So drones and satellites took the watch. Synthetic aperture radar spotted wakes under clouds. Infrared teased out engine heat against water that eats it. A drone swarm launched for wildlife monitoring, stitched high-res shoreline mosaics that doubled as watch lists for new tire tracks to a covert fuel tank. Tasking orders moved like market orders. Pop the satellite now, catch the convoy at the headland, cue the cutter at the choke. Action slid from observation to leverage. A cable-laying barge paused off a headland after a week of quiet positioning. The next morning, a patrol appeared exactly where a cut would sting. Nobody said sabotage. Everyone spoke in plausibles: fishing gear snag, small quake, maintenance window. Finance desks in 2 cities saw a latency spike and missed a trade by milliseconds. It read like a glitch. It played like a warning. Impact rippled across ledgers and lives. Insurers rewrote riders. AIS dock north of a certain parallel meant exclusions, not excuses. Charter parties added escort compliance clauses with penalties calibrated to Moscow's schedules. Crews found extra lines in their safety briefings that sounded like euphemisms. Follow the lead ship, accept inspection, don't improvise. For fishers, familiar grounds grew crowded with steel and rules that changed with the wind. Parallel to that, coastal watchstanders learned a new rhythm. Radios crackled with drone reports, unknown quad over the gravel pad, repeat flights at dusk. A new boy sang a digital note at odd hours. Then a quiet visit, 2 officials with cards that didn't list titles, asking if anyone had seen a skiff tied at the West Cove after midnight. Routine, they said. It was routine because the game required it. Here's where it gets blunt. Enforcement arrived as a stack. Cutters to board, drones to see, satellites to track, submarines to map, and lawyers to bless the after-action. None of it waited for boundaries to be blessed in New York. It moved on ice windows, convoy calendars, and the knowledge that in a place where help is far, the first ship on scene decides what lawful looks like. But there was one problem they couldn't clean up with presence. Every extra hull, every covert run, every cable cut risked the incident nobody could spin: a collision in the dark, a grounded tanker in a storm gap, a sensor web gone quiet in a real emergency. The choreography was tight, and winter doesn't applaud. Meanwhile, communities threaded the margins. A Coast Guard boarding brought food to a clinic 1 week and a fine to a cousin the next. A drone survey promised erosion grants and mapped a route to a private tank farm. A silent sub meant another flag claimed the seabed and maybe the future. Enforcement didn't just patrol the water, it rearranged who got to live from it. And with paperwork lagging, steel kept deciding. Ships wrote rules, sensors scored them, submarines underlined them. The map followed.